My name's Jo Grundy. I'm a postdoc at the University of Southampton, supervised by Regression. And my talk is on outlier detection in scientific discovery. It was ideally going to be on scientific data, but unfortunately there hasn't really been enough data yet. So it's on synthetic data mostly. Okay, so first I should describe what an outlier is, because people use a lot of different words for this. An outlier is also known as an anomaly or novelty, could be an aberration or an exception. Sometimes it is an oddity. And they are important. Now, here I use them to mean something that is caused by a different process. And that means something else is making this. It's not part of the noise of the original process. It is caused by something different. Now, it's a bit of a story told by many teachers that the ozone hole was in fact completely ignored by NASA as its algorithms flagged it as bad data because it was so outlying. It was outside the limits that they were really expecting. It was so low. And in fact, it's not quite as simple as that, because NASA did in fact go and one part of NASA anyway, did go and try and check their sensors to make sure that everything was working, but unfortunately they didn't talk to everybody else. And there are letters showing that they attempted to find out what was going on, but never really went anywhere before the British Antarctic expedition, using different sensors, managed to discover the same thing. So obviously, finding things that are exceptions, that stick out, is very important. It's something that people don't find very difficult. Things that stick out, generally stick out very easily to us, but not quite so much to machines. Now, in condition monitoring, this is very important. In fact, in health data, sensor data, we get a huge amount of unlabeled data. If there's outliers in this data, so something that's not part of the original pattern, this could indicate a problem. So say there's a slightly irregular heartbeat or a slightly different pattern in the heartbeat. This could indicate that somebody has a real problem. A difference in the pattern of the vibration of a machine could indicate a defect in the machine. Say there's a little bit of a defect in the size of a cog, making the machine vibrate slightly differently than it would have done. Outlier detection is also used in fraud detection, detecting network attacks, and there's a huge amount of other potential applications, if only we can get the machine learning algorithms to be good enough at it. Okay, so outliers can be obvious, though it does depend on the distribution of the data. To the human eye, it is quite obvious that this one at -4,4 in the top distribution is an outlier. It's not quite so clear whether the red dot at the bottom is an outlier or not. And in fact, it may or may not be. Here you've got what is an obvious outlier to a human, which is right in the middle, and slightly less obvious outliers, which could still appear to a machine to be part of the same distribution, and a very obvious outlier here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe some algorithms, and we'll talk about how we can use these algorithms to model the data and detect algorithms. Now, one way we can separate the outliers that are caused by a different process from outliers from the same distribution is to model them using extreme value statistics. Extreme value statistics are a way to characterize extreme values. It's a way to tell the difference between values caused by something else and that are just an extreme value of the same distribution as the rest of the data. And this uses a rule similar to the central limit theorem, which is also known as the Fisher-Tippett theorem. The central limit theorem, if you're not familiar with it, is the fact that when you sum a bunch of random numbers up enough with each other, you get something approximating a Gaussian distribution. Now, it isn't a Gaussian distribution in this case. In fact, there are 3 possible distributions that it can be fitted to. Here it's the Weibull distribution, which has been used to give a probability that a value is a maximum value from a normal distribution. So in this case, the distribution starts at 0 and has a standard deviation of 1. And this value on the x-axis is the value of the maximum value within that set. Now this curve here is when there are only 10 numbers of samples. So it takes 10 and then looks at the maximum value, and that is the number plotted here. So the most common maximum value is about 1.5, getting up towards 2. Now obviously if you have a larger number of values, then your maximum value is more likely to be higher. In this case, it's getting closer to 3, but it's a much more well-characterized, much more narrow distribution. And as you can see, the distribution fits reasonably well. With more samples, this distribution is much more clearly defined. You can look at Roberts from 2000 and subsequent work by Clifton, who have used this sort of extreme value distribution to characterize outliers on jet engine data and medical imaging data, as well as other condition monitoring problems, with quite a lot of success. In time series data, outliers are a bit of an issue. If they fall outside the original distribution, as you can see in the first picture there, it's not too difficult. You can see they're obviously outliers. A machine will see they are outliers. They're obviously not where they're supposed to be. In the second case, you can see that that outlier, although obvious to the human eye, is still part of the same distribution of the data. It's just not at an expected position for that time in the series. So it's out of sequence. Contextual is another word for those outliers. These contextual outliers can be on their own, or they can be grouped. Type 1 outliers, where they are outside the original distribution, are not difficult to detect. Types 2 and 3, where they are part of the same distribution, are much trickier. So what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? I'm going to model the data. So I'm going to find a range of machine learning algorithms that model the pattern that the data gives. I'm going to use this for each algorithm to generate an outlier score, and then I'm going to rank the samples by a score. Now, some other people, when they do this, classify as outlier or not outlier, as a binary thing. And I don't think this is as useful as a ranking, because sometimes you might be very much interested in just one or two of the most extreme outliers. Sometimes you might, for example, in the case of fraud, be very interested in anything that could be an outlier. And in fact, depending on where you want to draw that line, how important it is that you detect these outliers, knowing the ranking of each of the readings becomes a lot more important. So the data we're going to use, because much experimental data is not labeled, I'm going to use unlabeled data. It may contain outliers. It is multivariate, and it may well be periodic. So for this, I use a range of different data. But to start with, I'll go through the algorithms. Now, traditionally in time series data, we use a univariate time series data. We traditionally model it using autoregression. So we use a previous set of values to predict the next value. And this is a linear regression. The generalization to multidimensional data is the same, but it's a vector autoregression. And we have the equation here. So we have a constant plus the matrix of values multiplied by the vector of previous values, plus another matrix. So these are the matrix multipliers, just like the multipliers in unidimensional regression, plus an error term. And the error term would be what defined the outlier. So the larger the error term, the bigger the difference between the actual and the predicted value. And this is what we use to generate an outlier score. It is, however, sorry, my mouse is a little bit sensitive. It is, however, linear, so it will have problems with nonlinear data, and it is itself sensitive to outliers. So if it has outliers in what it's using to model, it may struggle to correctly identify what is and what is not an outlier. Now, VAR, vector autoregression, only works well with data that is linear. However, it is also possible to use regression to model how the different features vary with each other. So say this here is a sample, a set of 6 different samples with 6 different features. We can split off one of those features, because we don't have any labels. We can split off one of those features and use the values in the other 5 features of the same sample to predict that sixth feature. And we can do that for each one of them. And we come up with a linear model to predict each one of that sixth feature from the features from the previous 5 features. Now this can give us a model of how the different features are varying with each other. Now obviously we don't know if one feature is more important than the other. So what we do is we repeat this for every single feature. And if there is an error between the predicted value, we use this and we add them up for each repetition, and the sum of errors is used as the outlier score. And this gives us a family of, I want to go the other way. This gives us a family of similar autoregressive methods. So FRO is feature regression using ordinary least squares. L is using lasso or L1 regression. This is using the absolute value of the weights, so making the weights sparse rather than small. And FRR is using ridge regression, which is L2 regularization, so having smaller, more subtle weights to model the series. Okay, now there are masses of different types of algorithms, so I'm going to put them into different families. The second family of algorithms after regression is the density methods. Now a number of methods are used and these model the density of the data. The first and most common and widely used one is a one-class support for vector machine. This is very much based on the original support vector machine, only it has one class. And it fits a decision boundary around the densest part of the data in a kernel space. In this particular case, the kernel is a radial basis function, and nu is a parameter used to dictate the number of outliers that we are expecting. Now, with the previous data set I showed you, you can see that it does realize that the one in the middle is an outlier. It's far enough in the kernel space to be detected as an outlier. Unfortunately, this one at -1, 0.5 by the way it looks, is not detected. Oops. The other 3 are nicely detected as outliers. So this is actually quite successful in this particular case. Gaussian mixture models have also had some use in condition monitoring data. And it fits a specified number of Gaussian distributions to the data using expectation maximization. Now, this again has nicely detected that the 2 in the middle are the most outlying. The one on the outside is the most outlying. It looks like some of the ones closer to the edge, some of the more normal values are not quite modeled correctly. Now, obviously, in 2 dimensions, it's easy to have a good guess at the number of distributions we should be using. In this case, I chose 4 because it fits the data quite nicely. In multi-dimensional space, it is not so clear. So for the rest of the work, however high the dimension, I'm afraid I have set K to be 3, which is not very nice for a Gaussian mixture model. But as with normal data, you have no idea what the data looks like. So it's often very difficult to decide on the value of these hyperparameters, which is one reason why the simpler algorithms can be more effective. DBScan is another one. It's been used by banks in particular to detect fraud. And this is clustering by using a minimum distance between the points to see which should be in the same cluster. You need to set 2 hyperparameters in this case, a minimum number of points that should be in the same cluster and a minimum distance. And you can see it does appear to quite nicely model the distribution of the data again, and it would in fact correctly rank the outliers as such. There's only one ensemble method that I have used. In this case, it's isolation forest. Now, I thought this was a really cool method because it finds the minimum number of random divisions to separate out each particular point from the whole group. So it divides it at different random points at different dimensions, and stops after a certain number. So it's a number of binary decisions. So it's a bit like a decision tree. And if it's not very many, then the outlier score that it gives will actually be quite low. So in other words, I've used the negative of that because I want it to be a higher score, giving the outlier number to be higher. So as you can see, it's correctly ranked that as an outlier, that's an outlier, that's an outlier. The 2 points in the middle, it has also correctly ranked as outliers. So this is getting 100% right. This is doing very well here. Okay, so everyone's favorite algorithms are deep learning algorithms. They're very sexy. Everyone thinks these are the algorithms of the time, the state of the art. And they are very varied. They are, the one thing they have in common is they are all neural nets with depths deeper than 2. They don't have anything else in common. Okay, autoencoders work by reconstructing the data through a bottleneck. This gives a lower dimensional representation of the data. And what you can do is you can feed in the original data, get it to reconstruct itself, and once you've trained the model, you run it through again, and when the error is higher, you have something that is more outlying. So the higher reconstruction error is used as the outlier score. We train it using backpropagation, as you do with most neural nets. In this case, it doesn't do so well. It maybe doesn't have enough data to work. Deep learning is much more successful and it has a huge amount of data. It has detected the furthest outlier, but does not rank these correctly. In fact, it thinks the one in the middle is the least outlying. Variational autoencoders, to some extent, work similarly. They reconstruct the data. They are trained using backpropagation. But in this case, the data in the middle, the bottleneck is modeling a distribution. And instead of using that directly, what we do is we draw from that distribution, we sample that distribution, and that is what we use for backpropagation. We also use the Kullback-Lever divergence between the distributions as well as the reconstruction loss in training, because we want to model the distribution of the data, the original distribution. Okay, and you can see the variational autoencoder really doesn't quite get this. Yes, it does find your furthest outlier, but it doesn't quite get the whole of the distribution. Possibly it has not been trained for long enough. Again, with the deep learning algorithms, the selection of hyperparameters is very important and needs to be done carefully for each set of data, which sometimes you do not have the luxury of doing. Now, LSTMs, I'm not going to go into a massive amount of details here. LSTM stands for long short-term memory, which is possibly the least snappy name for an algorithm. Here is a diagram of it. It's from my lecture notes from when I was a student. And as you can see, it's pretty complicated. You've got a forget gate and you've got this internal state. Your forget gate tells the machine whether it should be saving or saving the data or throwing out the data. Input gate and input node decide what of the data should be stored. And your output gate, again, decides what the output is going to be, and that's your H here. Now, the recurrent networks, the LSTM is a recurrent network, has the whole thing of this as one time step. So every time step it takes in a new set of data, runs it through and outputs something which could be a prediction of the next one. Now, the error between this prediction and the actual values is used as our outlier score. And again, the reconstruction error is, the reconstruction error is our outlier score. The gated recurrent unit, the GRU, is slightly less complicated. It's a lot newer, but it does not store an internal state. The hidden state is exposed to the rest of the data. This is a picture I stole off the internet. I did not have time to draw a proper one, I'm afraid. It is also used almost as successfully as LSTMs in modeling time series data. Now, matrix methods have had a lot less attention. There are many that have had application in data science, non-negative matrix factorization and SVD, truncated support vector decomposition in latent semantic analysis, for example. but the more modern methods haven't been fully exploited. Now, robust PCA was developed in 2009, and in fact, there's a variety of ways to do this. It is because PCA itself, principal component analysis, is very widely used. It's very easy. There's lots of library applications there that will do it for you. However, it is very sensitive to corrupt data. So if you've got even just a few widely outlying, widely corrupt data points, it will skew very much the distribution that you're getting. So one thing, this Candes et al. From 2009, robust PCA recovers a low rank approximation of the data, separating out the noise and corruption. And it does this, so this is your matrix, your data matrix, which is a P by N matrix. So your samples are the columns here, and the number of features is going across. And it has some corruptions, has some duff values. And the idea is we use component pursuit to extract the lower rank approximation, in this case L, and also the table of outliers, the sparse matrix of outliers. And this is where the extra data gets put. And that's solved by using a convex optimization. Now, since then, there's been quite a lot of development. Outlier Pursuit, for one, uses a similar method, but in this case, it assumed that it's just one or two of the values, not just the parts of the values, not just the different features of the values, but whole columns of values that are causing the problems. So in this case, the low rank approximation of the data is recovered, and it is a column sparse matrix C containing information about those outliers. And we can sum very directly the values in that C matrix, and that gives us a score for each and every sample. In this case, it looks very much like 1 and 4 are outliers. Now, much more recently, in the last couple of years, graph regularized outlier pursuit has been used rather successfully on some biological data. In this graph, in this method, the graph Laplacian of the data is used to help the algorithm find a lower rank matrix better modeled to the lower dimensional manifold structure of the data. And this solves the same problem. Now, here we're solving another convex optimization. It's a little bit more complicated, and it does have problems with larger data sets because you need to build up a graph of the whole data set in order to be able to communicate the lower dimensional substructure to the algorithm. But this, like I said, when there have been a lot of features and not so many samples, has been very successful. Now, my data, because of one thing and another this year, there hasn't been much in the way of actual data being generated. So I've been using my own synthetic data. And I've used 6 different procedures to do that. There's a variety of them. D1 here is a high dimensional curve, which has an explicit lower dimensional structure, the product of a lower dimensional sine and cosine set of waves. D2 is the product of 2 lower dimensional random walks. D3 is just one straight plane random walk. D4 is a set of very similar sine waves. D5 is modulated sine waves. As you can see, the frequency changes. In this case, it goes faster, but it is entirely random, whether it goes faster or slower. And D6 is a non-linear process. I've used the McKay-Glass series with randomized starting positions within the normal starting sort of range, which, as you can see, gives different series that are getting more and more out of sync with each other as the time carries on. Now you can see here the outliers have been marked with a little red O, and in D1, those outliers are very plain to the human eye. Not so much in D2, very clear in D3, not quite so easy to see in D4, slightly simpler in D5, not so easy in D6. Let's see how the machines cope. So just using a plain PCA plot, you can see that the outliers are very clear in D2 and perhaps surprisingly in D5, but very unclear in the nonlinear series, which is what we'd expect. but also in D1 and D3, where the outliers were so obvious to the human eye, but not all of them would be obvious in a PCA plot. Now, for each data set, noise was added, and this was scaled by a noise factor, in this case 0.1. Outliers are generated by adding a random number, scaled by a p-quant to a fraction of the features, which we're calling this fraction p-frac, which means I can control just exactly how obvious these outliers are. Okay, so in this work, I have used two ways to measure the success of the algorithms: the area under curve, AUC, and the false positive rate, FPS. AUC should be familiar to most people with a machine learning background. It is called the area under the receiver operating curve. It is plotted by moving a threshold up from the lowest ranks to the highest ranked example. Now, the true positive rate is plotted on one side against the false positive rate. And as you can see, these two distributions are pretty well separated. So what you get here is when you start moving from what is a very low false positive rate to a pretty low false negative rate. 1 is perfect, and 0.5, which is this dashed line here, is no better than random. If you're getting 0 on an AUS, you have a system that is ranking perfectly upside down, which would be very surprising. Now, FPS is the false positive rate. This is a metric used when you really do not want any false negatives. So, for example, if you have a set of medical images, you really do not want the algorithm to miss something that could possibly be cancerous. You would much rather it picked quite a lot of non-cancerous but slightly suspicious ones than missed one cancerous one. So what we do here is we rank the data points by the score that is given, and we count the number of normal ones that are ranked above the lowest scoring true outlier. This number is divided by the total number that are above the lowest scoring true outlier. I've given two examples here to give you an idea how this works. If the scores for 5 pieces of data are 10, 10, 9, 3, and 1, and the actual outlierness, in this case, I've just given it as outlier or not outlier, is 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, that means it's incorrectly labeled this last one as very much normal when it is in fact an outlier. This, despite only one outlier being incorrectly ranked, gives us a false positive rate of 1, which means it's really not doing very well. If the scores are ranked almost the same, but with no outlier that is incorrectly ranked, and everything in fact is correctly ranked, this gives a false positive rate of 0. So it's a really good way of indicating whether an algorithm is making sure that all of the outliers are highly ranked in outlier score. 0 here would be perfect, and 1 is when your lowest ranked sample is an outlier, even if everything else is correct. Okay, so there are a lot of numbers here, exploring how broadly the algorithm is used. This is a number that's an average from a range of numbers of features and numbers of samples, from 10 to 1,000 samples, 10,000 samples, to from 2 to 32 features. And you can see that by and large, FRO and FRFAR, the feature-based regression algorithms, are very much the successful algorithms. Isolation forest does pretty well. On-class SVM is fairly consistently good in terms of the area under the curve. Now, this doesn't give us a huge amount of information though. So what I did in order to better see what was going on is I plotted a heat map. So you could see for each combination of number of samples and number of features, how the algorithm was performing. Here I only plotted the area under the curve. So because it's area under the curve, you can see that from the color bar here, this is not doing any better than random. And in fact, it doesn't seem to matter what number of features or samples, or even what data set you have. Vector autoregression, which is widely used traditional method for this, just does not succeed. However, feature-based regression is remarkably successful. So this is using ordinary least squares, and this is using L2 regularization. Both of these algorithms do very well. So long as it's got above a certain number of features, it does much better for 4 features and above than it does for 2. Unsurprisingly, given that it is using the number of features and as an advantage, even with 32 features, even with quite a large number of features in a very high dimensional space, it is very successful. The same is said of the ridge-based regression, only it's not quite so successful with slightly fewer samples. The same is true in D6, although the nonlinearity does make it much harder for both of these algorithms to work with. However, it's clear that with a certain number of features, it is more successful, and it gets more successful the more features it has. So in fact, you could say here it is turning the curse of dimensionality into a blessing. So both of them need a certain number of samples and a certain number of features, but not too many. It's surprising how well they do. So for density-based algorithms and for the ensemble-based algorithms, which I've thrown in here, you can see OCSVM is nice and fast and pretty successful. Surprisingly, perhaps, Gaussian mixture models do very well, despite having the hyperparameters set, so it's only using 3 different distributions. It needs a certain number of samples to work. It doesn't work too well in a lower number of samples, but it doesn't seem to mind however many, it doesn't seem to mind however many features you throw at it, which is good. It also doesn't seem to mind having lots of features, which was a bit of a surprise because I was expecting Gaussian mixture models not to do very well in higher dimensional space. Isolation forest does well, again, rather surprisingly, in higher dimensional space and with more features. dbScan, again, needs a certain number of features to start working. And again, this could well be to do with the hyperparameter settings. So if the minimum distance starts to work when it's in a certain higher dimensional space, then that possibly could give that region of better behavior. For D6, because of the nonlinearity, none of these methods are hugely successful. But then D6 was pretty hard for all of the algorithms. Okay, so deep learning was not a great success. And I suspect this is mostly to do with overfitting. LSTMs especially really do struggle first because they overfit the outliers. And when they are fitting to those outliers, they are ignoring the rest of the pattern. And having done some experiments where I looked at one-dimensional space to see what an LSTM was doing, it looked like it fitted the outlying values first before fitting the general pattern. That, I think, will take a lot more work to try and get around. Autoencoders, however, do really nicely. As one would expect, they're fine with larger number of samples. Perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not, they do better with large numbers of features as well. But to an autoencoder, that's probably just more data. And again, with D6, it struggles when it has above a certain number of samples, probably just because as the time series continues, the data gets more and more out of whack, and it really struggles. VAEs, surprisingly, really don't get it either. Though they work in a similar way to autoencoders, perhaps sampling from the distribution really isn't giving it enough information to find what it wants, as it's not modeling that distribution carefully enough. And if we look at the 2 matrix methods, we can see that Outlier Pursuit and graph regularized Outlier Pursuit don't work particularly well with larger numbers of samples. In fact, graph regularized Outlier Pursuit timed out when it got above 10,000 samples, which made it very difficult to use. The big problem with graph regularized Outlier Pursuit is building the graph of the data. But as you can see, it is reasonably successful with moderate sample numbers and large numbers of features. both of them seem fine with large numbers of features. Okay, sensitivity. So because I could control the amount that the outliers are, I could say explore the whole range of different, from the very, very weakest little outliers to the blatantly obvious, you ought to be able to see this sort of outliers. So I varied p frac and p quant. So that's the amount that I'm adding, the scaling of the amount I'm adding, and the number of different features I'm adding it to as a fraction of the whole total number of features. And I've kept their n equal to 1000 and p equal to 32, just so it would run in reasonable time. And as you can see, FRR wipes the board. It is totally the best algorithm there. Now, for a few of the data sets, autoencoders, Outlier Pursuit, graph regularized Outlier Pursuit, and one-class SVMs are quite comparable. They do pretty well. But across the board, the most generally applicable does appear to be the new regularization algorithms. Now, as you can see, both D1 and D6, very, very successful. This tells you that it's detecting outliers when they are scaled by a factor of 0.05, so very, very weak, and on a very small number of the features. And that's true for both FRO and FRR. So even when just a tiny number of the features are perturbed, it picks it up. Quite nicely, the lasso does seem to show that it is less sensitive, but will pick it up. This does show that the other experiments I was running are about here. So it was just not obvious enough as an outlier for the lasso regression to pick up, which would indicate that the sparsity that you get from the weights is what's letting it down. Vector autoregression, obviously, again, no better than random. Density-based algorithms, one-class SVM really quite successful, as is dbScan. As is isolation forest. They do very well for dataset 1. Dataset 6, not so much, but still one-class SVM, IF, very successful. Gaussian mixture models struggle with the non-linearity, and for some reason, dbScan just doesn't quite get it. There's just too much there, it can't quite fit it. And again, that may be to do with the hyperparameters chosen for this particular system. And in the deep learning system, again, the recurrent nets don't get it. Again, they may well need to be properly tuned and carefully done for every single different type of data set, which was not what I was looking for here. What I was looking for was something much more general. When you don't know what the data really looks like, when you don't really know what you're looking for, you want an algorithm you can throw at it without having to spend forever trying to tune it. And autoencoders do pretty well, though they are pretty slow. Compared to the regression methods, which are almost instantaneous, LSTMs and GRUs take a much longer. Autoencoders don't take quite as long as the recurrent nets, but do still take quite a while. VAEs are not very sensitive. This shows that when the outliers are really obvious, it gets it. I'm guessing that it just models the distribution in a bit of a fuzzy sort of way, so it doesn't really see where the outliers are until they are pretty obvious. Now, the last experiment I did was increasing an amount of noise. Now, this is a lot simpler because what I did was I only looked at the algorithms that had had any success in the previous experiments. Rather surprisingly, you can see dbScan is immensely sensitive to noise. And for such a widely used algorithm, that did surprise me. Outlier Pursuit and graph regularized Outlier Pursuit are sensitive to noise, but only slowly increasing in sensitivity. And autoencoders for feature regression with ordinary least squares and with ridge regression work very, very well, even with a whole extra set of random values being added or taken away, which is actually pretty good. I was pretty pleased by that. So, in conclusion, LSTMs and GRUs require careful tuning for each use case, which is probably what's causing the problem. They are overfitting to the outliers. You would have to have clean data to train them on first, which you would not have necessarily for every system. The feature regression systems, FRO and FRR, one-class SVMs, autoencoders, and isolation forests all work pretty well on most cases. And these are the simplest methods, especially the regression methods. They seem to work best and are generally faster. And in fact, the novel simple method, the feature regression, does appear to be best in this set of tests. So that's the conclusion of my talk. Are there any questions?